name's Nick Houde, and I'm going to talk to you today about some initial research that I'm doing related to what I think could be a vertically integrated labor union, and I'll unpack more of what that means for me. And basically, I don't have it fully researched yet, and so this chance right now is an opportunity to kind of think with you guys as far as where this has legs, if you think it might be something worth pursuing, and hopefully with some of that feedback and other feedback I'll get down the line, I would hopefully turn this into a full-fledged research project and eventually an actionable plan to make these vertically integrated labor unions. So yeah. Oh, and I want to make a disclaimer too, is that so far in the research I've only focused on labor unions as they've been conceptualized in the European and North American context. And I don't mean that they're just there, but historically they came from there. And I think that there's quite a few other ways of organizing labor and histories of that I'm not aware of at this point. So I just want to acknowledge that it will be limited in scope in that regard. So, yeah. So, trade unions. What are they and what have they done? So trade unions, or labor unions, have been around as formal entities in Europe since at least the 18th century. They sprung up most prominently in England during its rapid industrialization and quickly spread to other parts of the world. What they made possible was a way to formalize and institutionalize collective bargaining among workers, which has largely dealt with kind of semi-spontaneously by workers for centuries. Each of these unions of workers sought to improve the conditions of employment, leveraging their collective power through numbers to challenge their bosses. Being the people who actually performed the labor within industry, their power came from their ability to shut down or dismantle the ability to produce that work. In Europe and North America, unions became essential in early reforms for labor standards, for child labor laws, for working hours, for wage requirements, and they gained enormous popular appeal in the mid-20th century, having peaked in popularity concurrently with many socialist tendencies around the 1960s. During this period, labor and trade unions became legally protected in many of these countries, England being one of the first in 1872, Germany beginning in 1897, and sadly, much further down the line because of a protracted series of legal frameworks and incrementalism, the US in 1935. So, anti-union legislation and their declining popularity. Despite the fact that unions played such an important role in agitating for fair labor and demonstratively making a more equitable society, a backlash against their effectivity and practicality during the stagnant economic years of the 1970s, helped usher in the new agenda of neoliberals, keen on stripping away protective legislations and barriers in service of a frictionless freedom of trade. Since then, the history of unions has become a bit more messy. While some heavy industrial sectors of the global North's economy still retain a high union density, shifts toward gig-based and service-oriented labor have undercut many of the protections by existing in employment gray areas, with only provisional legal frameworks to organize around. Similarly, many unions during this period began to expand, adding large administrations to handle their many members, while inadvertently choking collective bargaining by the same managerial restraint they had hoped to ameliorate. My vision is terrible today, I'm sorry. Still, union density, the amount of workers in a region that are unionized, that's the formal term for that, remains high in places such as Scandinavia, but is almost universally in decline across the globe, especially in parts of Asia and Africa, at home to some of the most egregious practices in the global economy. Although there are many divergent and differing opinions about this trend, I would like to argue that this is due to a waning ability for labor to effectively handle collective bargaining against global multinationals and the planetary supply chains they have made commonplace at scale. That is, I do not think that the lackluster support of unions currently is a result of widespread ideological capitulation to neoliberalism, but rather that people have felt powerless and unsupported by labor unions that have not kept pace with transformations in the character of labor and production in the 21st century. Union busting, of course, has become quite ruthless in many places, especially in high-stakes zones such as Mexico and Southeast Asia, where activists have even been killed. But even this, I would argue, is a product of labor's inability to garner enough power to oppose these practices. All this means that unions don't need some mere rebranding or hype campaign, as many unimaginative leftists might think, but instead, unions need to be updated structurally so that they can become more formidable again, actively and effectively bargaining for collectives of workers that work for many firms in many sectors and in many locations all around the world. What drives this claim is the structural legal function that gives unions their power, that is, scale and structure. A single worker fighting for better conditions is largely incapable of generating a formidable threat against a firm. The negotiations are simply too unequal. The power imbalance is too great in favor of the employer. While the worker only owns their labor, a firm usually owns the legal and infrastructural equipment to produce what the worker creates. Even in the case of jackpot economies, where it is the specific talents of the worker that are the essential focus of the enterprise, the firm or firms supporting said talented person have often worked out means for minimizing transaction costs in a given market, therefore giving them a networked capital advantage. Similarly, legal arbitration between these two scales is asymmetrical at best, provided that an individual human has quite different rights and obligations than a firm does with regard to entering into contracts or civil court disputes, particularly with regards to culpability and financial penalties. What unions do is to try to solve this issue of scale by enabling workers to collectively band together to form legally recognized entities. The soft power of this is obvious, that a group of workers together is always more formidable than an individual, especially in the face of a many-person firm with opaque obligations around culpability. Unions, however, attempt to take a step further by institutionalizing this soft power in a form of legal entity that has similar rights and obligations to other many-personed entities such as firms. In legal parlance, this is called the juridical person, which is loosely defined as a group or organization that operates under a single identity. It is conferred with similar rights as a legal person, through their legal incorporation as an entity. While this sounds a bit convoluted, ultimately, it is a legal way to deal with scale by attributing culpable entities that can be defined formally and equivalently. For the last 20 to 30 years, firms themselves have gotten larger and more diffuse. The issue of scale has become more complicated as such, and many forms of production have moved away from singular factories or enterprises and into vast interdependent networks of firms and service providers that distribute the production process all over the world so as to take advantage of low material cost, low labor cost, and minimal regulatory standards that all help to drive down the bottom line. This has been bolstered by the Marrakesh Agreement, which birthed the WTO in 1994. Creating a binding intergovernmental body to set a legal framework for firms operating in this manner. This internationalization of global production that was catalyzed by these agreements has radically transformed where and how the production of many goods takes place throughout the world. And now, with logistics technology keeping pace, providing for just-in-time production processes and flexible factory technology, these global supply chains seem more robust and astonishing than ever. Curiously, however, these new WTO standards that regulate how globalized production is dealt with in international law do not provide any provisions for how labor is to function amidst this new paradigm. Nations in the global north, such as the US, actually have attempted to add these provisions in the WTO Charter, but these efforts were refused by a number of nations in the global south, who saw cheap labor as their comparative advantage in the world market. Bodies like the International Labor Organization have attempted to provide some of these frameworks in lieu of their absence in the WTO agreements, but these have mostly focused on ethical or value-laden claims that are difficult to enforce and kind of difficult to formulate. What has therefore emerged is a rift in scale between the legal parameters of firms and those of labor. While firms have increasingly been able to codify frameworks for contracts and arbitration internationally, worker unions are left with little more than the legal frameworks of their physical jurisdiction. This is especially the case for unions, which may be international, but do not have the same international legal frameworks that make their actions effective. So what can be done about this? So my suggestion is to take a two-pronged approach to this problem. And the first involves thinking about and working with legal scholars in international law that might be able to write in labor provisions into the WTO standards. The second would be to create a model for a labor organization that would be able to kind of mirror the production model of global supply chains. So in that way, it has the same sort of leverage capacity that the former unions would have had in a factory, because they controlled the supply and the demand of the labor in a given supply. So to the first point, this is a bit above my pay grade, being that I'm not a lawyer, but if this project gets moving, the idea would be to work with international labor lawyers to begin working on this challenge. One major element that might help matters is to draw a means of remittance into these provisions, into the WTO charters, in the model for labor organization. This means that there needs to be some mechanism, such as a social dividend on wage increases, or something along those lines, that disproportionately gives money to the lowest paid workers in the supply chain. This way, the comparative advantage still remains, but with the end goal of wage parity between different labor markets. By making provisions like this very prominent, I wonder if there could be more incentive for nations in the global south to sign on. This idea also comes at a strange time when the power of the WTO is waning. Currently developing trade wars and the imposition of tariffs by the US, China, and the UK, to name a few, have already begun to compromise the otherwise reasonably strong enforcement capability of the WTO. While it is one of the only formally binding intergovernmental organizations that exists, it's still at the behest of the asymmetrical leverage of global superpowers, who, if they revoked or countered any of the provisions, would largely delegitimize the organization and its tenets. Which is to say that it may not be perfect, but nevertheless, lobbying the WTO labor standards will be an essential to a new type of organization for this work. To my second point of creating a labor organization model that can mirror the organization of globalized firms and supply chains, I suggest rethinking the idea of vertical integration, only for labor rather than the firm itself. Vertical integration is a production model wherein a firm controls all aspects of the production in a given supply chain, from raw material to sales. One notable firm that championed this model in the early 2000s that many here might know was American Apparel, which produced all of the clothing in an LA factory, did their own advertising, and exclusively sold their products at their own stores. Similarly, Apple people discuss as vertically integrated, even though that doesn't really go all the way down into the factories. And there's many other firms as well. The advantage for a firm to do this is that it reduces transaction costs and enables a centralized control over supply and demand without the variance of other firms' rhythm of production and all of their cost fluctuations and all of these things. It's about kind of centralizing and controlling streams of capital and material so that it's all, it can all be dealt with quicker and with less provisional cost. Is also known as a vertical monopoly, in that this model monopolizes an entire supply chain through different sectors of the production process. This idea of a vertical monopoly seems the most fertile for a new model for unions, and that a vertically integrated union could control the supply and demand of labor for a given supply chain through a monopoly on labor power. This would mean that workers from each of the firms in a supply chain bind together with a formal organization that, if necessary, could potentially shut down the production of the supply chain effectively enough to become formidable, to become a formidable force against their corporate bosses. Now, this presents some obvious practical challenges. First is, how do you gather and communicate these people that are globally distributed, that speak different languages, that have different trades, that live all across the world? This is pretty difficult. And to especially do so in a way that would have all of their values and desires aligned is a pretty difficult coordination problem. Second, how do you manage all of this in a decentralized way that is still democratically handled when it comes to decision making? Because of course we are dealing with a group that is hopefully democratically opposing their bosses. In fact, many of their stakes are about their individual needs as powerless people, and therefore democracy is obviously a given. The third is how to build the aforementioned remittance into the lowest wage earners within the supply chain. So with something like a social dividend or something like this, in order to not only make this about getting laborers to work together across these vast supply chains internationally, but also so that the disparities in the disparity in the wages and the disparity in people's affordances for job possibilities and value creation are made more equivocal over time. So there's kind of this, I guess, transitional justice model built into this, wherein places in the global south would actually gain economically at a faster rate than those in the global north. So clearly these are not trivial organizational issues, and are perhaps the reason why some sort of scaled union hasn't come to be created. There has, however, been a remarkable amount of ideas coming from the blockchain space that could provide entry points into the knotted problem associated with this model, and possibly even present actionable technologies for their implementation. As I myself am quite new to this terrain, please bear with me because, yeah, I'm just learning about these things myself. Here I'm specifically curious about DAOs and DACs, or decentralized autonomous organizations and decentralized autonomous corporations, respectively. These organizational typologies are rule-based organizations that commit people towards some economic or social goal by using encrypted ledgers and gamified decision-making. In many ways, they seem to embody the scale effects of the juridical person that I had discussed earlier, in that they bring a group of individuals under one banner within a given framework. But what separates them from traditional organizations or corporations is that A, they rely exclusively on decentralized models for their internal governance and monitoring, and B, the enforcement mechanisms of this governance are handled by computational frameworks rather than human arbitrators. While this can be tricky, it does seem amenable to a slim union model that attempts to shed itself of much managerial oversight as possible. Internal governance issues, therefore, would stem from gamified properties that would be based on mechanisms oriented towards egalitarian consensus decision-making and commonly held standards and values. Many of these more autonomous infrastructures for these organizations even automate much of the decision-making in pursuit of an intelligence that would possibly be better than those of human agents. I'd be willing to see what that looks like, but I'm sure that this would need some consideration in grave detail, considering that users of this technology would most likely be wary of any entity, human or not, dictating the decisions and values their collective bargaining would take. DACs, for that matter, are particularly interesting with regard to what I mentioned earlier with wage remittance down the supply chain, where high-wage workers cede compensation toward overall wage parity, and that these typologies involve the paying of dividends. From a first glance, this could be a foundation for mechanisms that allow overall wage growth by union members to be redistributed down the supply chain, slowly eking out a way towards wage parity. On the negative side, these typologies are not always accessible to all those who would want to participate because of barriers in computation or in knowledge about how they function. The major challenge for using these typologies of organization would involve creating an application that can streamline this process and make them intuitive for a general audience, with low bandwidth and resolutely secure from the meddling of bosses. And yeah, so those are some of my first ideas, and I hope that some of them had a little bit of traction and made a little bit of sense. And I also wanted to very quickly thank Arthur for the creation of all of these great graphics and putting my head on Milton Friedman's body, etc. And also to Ricardo Saavedra and Kia Kreutler for explaining DAOs to me, because I'm pretty ignorant in that regard. So thank you.